1960s, a decade that rocked America to its core, with racial tensions at an all-time high. A group of college students, frustrated with the society around them, rose up and created an organization. An organization through its efforts that encountered a number of triumphs and tragedies. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 1960, Ella Baker, a student at Shaw University in North Carolina, created the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee after realizing the lack of student representation present in organizations like the SCLC. The committee began its efforts after a conference held at her school in which only 126 students attended, but it quickly grew as they began to fight for civil rights. This movement was felt in schools all over the South and accelerated change nationwide. Initially, SNCC was an organization for college campus protest groups that could coordinate and organize together. Most of these colleges were black colleges, like Spelman and Morehouse in Atlanta, Chaffin College in South Carolina, and Fisk University in Tennessee. These college students were itching for a change in the community, and Young and Furious set out to change the landscape of segregationist America.
As part of our project, we interviewed Dr. Nafisa Muhammad, a professor of history at Spelman College in downtown Atlanta. We asked her about what the legacy was of SNCC and its movement for civil rights. She described how many students, only in their teens and 20s, fought, even wanted to give up their lives so that they could ensure civil rights for all. She described also how women played an important role in this movement. Women were responsible for making flyers, pamphlets, and other important documents for the movement, as well as ensuring the Get Out to Vote movement by SNCC.
For example, Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, a female student from Spelman College in Atlanta, was the administrative secretary of SNCC. She organized the Freedom Riders and Get Out to Vote initiatives.
SNCC was very involved in peaceful protests and demonstrations. For example, they were actively involved in the 1963 March on Washington, during which SNCC chairman John Lewis railed against the federal government for taking little action in the Deep South, to the point where his speech had to be censored. However, there was no question as to what SNCC stood for. SNCC was also involved in the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, where protesters were confronted by deadly violence from local authorities and vigilante groups. Particularly, the infamous Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge included members of SNCC being brutally attacked by the police force, sparking national outrage as the incident was broadcast on TV. Voting rights came to the forefront of SNCC's agenda in the 60s as they tried to end the racist restrictions on the ability of someone to vote. During this time, many important marches took place to protest these impediments. Marches in Selma and Mississippi both were led by SNCC members taking charge to ensure blacks had equal power in choosing their leaders. During this event, the Selma Literacy Project workers, a group of SNCC, were attacked and arrested. This caused further marches in Selma and increased attention drawn to the racist attitudes there after the arrests. As the Selma voting rights campaign continued, many leaders, including John Lewis, Stokely Carmichael, and MLK Jr., were present to fight for their cause. They were again attacked, but they still fought for what they believed in. To them, this cause was worth death. Nothing was more famous than the SNCC sit-ins born out of the policy several restaurants had in only serving white people. During this, SNCC members sat at lunch counters and refused to move until served. To experience it for ourselves, we decided to go to the Center for Civil and Human Rights. Ben and I only had a small taste of the real and gruesome experience, but we were still shaken. It gives both of us a respect for what SNCC did to secure our civil rights.
In 1960, students in Atlanta were frustrated with the segregation that was taking place in various restaurants, stores, bathrooms, and water fountains. They decided to follow the footsteps of the Greensboro movement in staging sit-ins, this time at the richest department store in downtown Atlanta. Many protesters were present, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who joined SNCC. Unfortunately, most of the protesters were arrested and subjected to unfair and harsh treatment by the police in a non-violent protest. SNCC members expressed their gratitude to King for participating in these protests through a series of letters to the DeKalb County Jail. These letters documented the close relationship between King and SNCC members and how both worked together to help make changes in the civil rights movement. Later, these protests were countered by KKK marches, and they led to further civil unrest and violence between the two groups. They still responded with nonviolence and fought for what they believed in, even in the face of evil. This clearly shows the risk that was taken by these young students to fight for what they thought was right. In the end, this protest sparked negotiations. These sit-ins and protests sparked negotiations between African American leadership, religious management, and government employees of Atlanta. In March of 1961, they announced that they would desegregate the city, a major milestone for civil rights in the Southeast. Because of SNCC's protests, one of the biggest desegregations in the history of the United States had taken place, and they only demonstrated nonviolence to prove their point. This clearly demonstrates how SNCC had a lasting impact on the South and resulted in a triumph for all people fighting for civil rights. While this event resulted in equality for all, it did not come without a price. Tragically, hundreds of innocent protesters were sent to prison solely due to the color of their skin and the cause which they were fighting for. Many were injured or even killed while facing violence by the police and counter-protesters while walking peacefully. Although many people changed their minds, there were those who still did not believe in equality of the races. Many still felt that segregation should exist and embraced racist ideals. It is important that all remember the impact that SNCC had on the civil rights movement, the South, and the United States as a whole. Without the toil and suffering that they faced, we would not have the same equal rights policies that we have today. They showed great bravery. They were only young students, standing up to people with weapons, telling them that they shouldn't have equal rights. We can learn so much from their story, and it can motivate us to want to make change in our world today.
But what was lost in tragedy was regained in millions of terrific, wonderful ways in triumph. The activities SNCC partook in and initiated had a lasting impact on the South in so many ways. SNCC's involvement in protest led to the desegregation of the biggest cities like Atlanta in the Southeast, paving the way for later progress in civil rights. After the 1965 decision of the Supreme Court that prohibited racial discrimination in voting access, they helped to exponentially increase the black vote. Leaders like John Lewis, the former chairman of SNCC and now U.S. representative, are prominent in the U.S. government, while other members like Bernard Lafayette and Diane Nash are well remembered in U.S. history as crucial civil rights leaders. Even now, the impacts of SNCC can be felt. Black people can now register and vote in elections. Blacks and whites can travel together on public transport. Black people are now even in public office in the South. SNCC brought together and united the Black youth of America unlike ever seen before. From schools all over the nation, young people were interested in their well-being, and they wanted to fight for their rights and their future. SNCC were the colored youth people overlooked, the youth that people underestimated. But ultimately, their blood, sweat, and tears triumphed over all adversity.